The Norman and Florence Brody Family Foundation is dedicated to exploring topics of national and international importance and is proud to support Policy Watch with Doug Besheroff at the University of Maryland. From the University of Maryland, this is Policy Watch with Doug Besheroff.
Many observers believe that large parts of the U.S. educational system are in crisis. Too many American children are less prepared for future careers than foreign competitors, and disadvantaged children face a troubling gap in achievement. Can the growing number of educational entrepreneurs reverse these trends through innovative approaches to classroom teaching and school management? Joining us to consider the growing role of entrepreneurship in education is Frederick Hess, a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute and author of The Future of Educational Entrepreneurship. And now, the host of Policy Watch, Doug Besheroff.
Rick Hess, welcome to the University of Maryland and Policy Watch.
Thanks for having me.
You study educational policy in schools, and you've written this new book called The Future of Educational Entrepreneurship, Possibilities for School Reform. I have to say, I don't think I ever remember the word entrepreneurship being used in relation to schools. So what is educational entrepreneurship?
It's, a question a lot of people have, Doug. Educational entrepreneurship is individuals and organizations trying to solve educational problems in new and different ways, using new machinery, using new tools, taking new approaches, and not just doing this at a boutique level or in a classroom, but in a way that has the opportunity to really improve education at scale.
So it doesn't necessarily have to be like business entrepreneurs who are making money. This is just someone who's an aggressive reformer in some respects.
It can be. The difference between an aggressive reformer and entrepreneur is a little blurry, to be honest. When we think about aggressive reformers, though, we usually think about superintendents. We think about Joel Klein in New York City, or Michelle Rhee in Washington, D.C. What's really distinctive about these entrepreneurs is they're building organizations or they're offering tools which can help reformers across the spectrum. So they're helping a lot of districts tap into new talent, or they're providing technological tools that could help schools and districts across the land.
So something like educational activists?
When we think about education activists or advocates, these are the people who go to the state capitol or Washington, D.C. and ask for more money, or they call for new test systems.
So this is opposite unions. So
opposite, frequently.
This is everybody but the unions?
For many times in practice, that's what it means. What's a little different about these entrepreneurs, organizations like Teach for America, or New Leaders for New Schools, or the KIPP schools, of which many people have heard, is that they might be doing a little bit of advocacy, but that's not really what they're about. What they're really about is trying to build solutions to particular problems.
And I take it that the entrepreneurship world is divided between for-profits, not-for-profits, and even some government activities. Why don't we go through these? So, for-profits. What's the lay of the land for educational for-profits that are entrepreneurial?
No, it's a great question. The reality is most of the for-profit presence, and let's talk about K-12 education. We can broaden it out to higher education we want to, but staying with kind of our K-12 schools. Most of the for-profit presence we take for granted. It's part of the backdrop. The people who sell textbooks to schools, those are all for-profit companies. The pencils, the school buses, all of this is provided by for-profits, but we usually don't think about it very much. And we certainly don't think of these as entrepreneurial organizations. These are much more like Detroit automakers than they are like Silicon Valley.
I think these days we definitely say that's not entrepreneurial.
I think that's exactly right. There is a very small body of entrepreneurial for-profit activity. One such effort is National Heritage Academies, which is running 50, give or take, charter schools in about a half dozen states. And this is a for-profit company that's privately held that if children attend those schools, because they're charter schools, some of the state money that pays for the schools follows those children, and National Heritage Academies tries to make a profit off of that.
And there are some states that have more of these than others. Arizona has a lot of these privates.
Exactly right. Maryland has very few. Virginia has very few. So you find substantial variation state by state.
And this is all because of regulation. This is not because the people in the state do or don't want it.
That's right. For the most part, that's exactly right. Charter schooling is simply a law that says instead of children going to the local school in that neighborhood or in that district and them getting the local money in that district, getting the local money and the state money, that other entities can open schools in that state, and that permits some of these not-for-profits or for-profits to come into that state. So it really depends on what the state legislature chooses to allow. You will also find in that for-profit space some of these companies that are selling particular solutions. There's an operation called SchoolNet, which helps school districts manage all this data that they're trying to struggle with. There's an organization called Wireless Generation.
Now, wait a minute. Why does there have to be an outside company to help schools deal with their data? Why don't they just put it in a computer somewhere?
Wouldn't it be nice if they did? The reality is that if you go into school districts, and even districts which brag about their data, and especially their ability to show you information on students' reading and math scores in elementary or middle school, that otherwise the data seems a lot like what it must have seemed to go into your neighborhood grocery store in 1983. Very little of this data is readily accessed. They have to do printouts. It's hard to actually get visuals which cleanly or readily explain the data. They simply have dozens of different programs and data systems coexisting that have never been updated, many of which are 20 or 30 years old. So some of these for-profit entrepreneurs are trying to sell solutions to these districts that are going to give them the ability to manage information.
So these are sort of data processing type information systems.
Exactly.
Before we talk about the schools, any other kinds of entrepreneurial for-profit activities going into the schools?
Sure. There's some that are doing tutoring services. Under the No Child Left Behind law that was passed several years ago, there's a provision which says that if children are at schools that fail to make adequate yearly progress for a certain number of years, those children are eligible for supplemental education services. This is essentially tutoring with some of the federal aid. There's a number of for-profit providers that are trying to provide those tutoring services, for instance. So what you'll find is these for-profits scattered throughout, but they really constitute a very small percentage of the overall activity, and even less of the activity that your viewers are likely to read about in the morning papers.
Now, I think our viewers are most interested in the schools. This is the package. And there are for-profit charter schools and so forth, and there are also non-profit. I suppose the first question is, do the for-profits look very different from the not-for-profit charter schools?
They don't. For the most part, they don't. There's only a few prominent for-profits. We mentioned National Heritage Academies. There's Edison Learning.
Now, Edison was the first, I think.
Edison was the first out of the box 15 years ago now.
Never took hold in the way its promoters expected?
Not at all. In fact, the initial out of the box, Chris Whittle, who launched Edison, he had an initial plan when Bush, the former President Bush, was talking about creating school vouchers at the national level. Chris Whittle had a vision of opening a chain of 1,000 private schools across the land which were going to attract students using these federal vouchers. That proposal never got anywhere under President Bush, and so what happened was Chris Whittle repositioned Edison to focus on charter schooling, which was at that point just starting to become, it was about 4 or 5 years old across the land at that point.
And with mixed success?
Yeah, with mixed success. Certainly there's evaluations. There's a well-known evaluation by Rand Corporation of Edison in Philadelphia, which Edison proponents suggest shows that their schools are outgaining Philadelphia schools as a whole. There's certainly respectable critics of particular elements of that evaluation. On the whole, the results seem to be relatively promising for Edison, but the same can also be said of several of the most attractive not-for-profit charter schools.
Such as?
Such as, the most famous is probably the KIPP Academies, which started in Houston, which now run 60-odd schools serving about 16,000 kids across the country, primarily serving low-income African-American children with some really impressive results in terms of achievement and the likelihoods of kids finishing high school and going on to college. Another is the Green Dot Public Charter Schools out of Los Angeles, which is interesting because the founder, Steve Barr, has found ways to cooperate with the unions and has actually created what they call a thin contract. There's an organization called Achievement
You should
First.
tell everyone what a thin contract means.
Thin contract means if you know much about education, you know that these teacher union contracts can frequently run 100, 150 pages with lots of I's and T's kind of dotted and crossed. The Green Dot contract looks much more like the employment policy handbook at a major corporation. It stipulates some reasonable procedures, some expectations, but otherwise you find very few of the hindrances on management that you would find in most public schools.
Now, KIPP is very well known, and I think the Bushes showed it off at the 2000 convention, Republican convention. But surely a non-for-profit charter school must do something differently than a for-profit.
They, it's surprising. Not as much that's obvious as you would think. The pillars that what seem to characterize, there's about 4,000 charter schools across the country today.
4,000?
About 4,000. It's hard to argue that more than about maybe 500 at the upside are really high performing. The majority of charter schools don't appear obviously much better than traditional district schools. But there is this population, these Green Dots, these KIPPs, these Achievement Firsts, these about a dozen of these organizations, generally relatively small, that really do appear to do things that work. And what tends to characterize them tends to be relatively similar. They set really high expectations. They're able to enforce those expectations, in part because children and parents choose to attend these schools, which means that if you don't want to abide by these rules, you're not part of that school community.
Of course, that means they have an easier student body to deal with. So the social scientists would call that a selection effect, right?
That's exactly right. And what's important is that these students are very high poverty, and they are disproportionately children of families where neither parent went to college. But you're exactly right, is that they're maybe different from their peers in that they have chosen to take advantage of this opportunity, which may create opportunities for success.
But I interrupt you. So high demand.
That's right. So the high expectations for students. They have remarkable faculties in many cases. Many of these Teach for America, young, hardworking teachers want to wind up in these school environments. So whereas other school districts might have trouble finding math and science teachers, you will find 5 or 10 or 30 applicants.
So another selection effect here. This is creaming. This doesn't look like it's going to be as tough as it might be.
Well, that's right. And one of the challenges here is, are the KIPPs and the Green Dots attracting teachers who would otherwise flow into Washington, D.C. and Los Angeles schools, or are they actually creaming out of the consulting sector and out of folks who used to go to work for Lehman Brothers when they still existed, and are now choosing to come into education because they can be part of an effective
before I ask
organization?
you your opinion, what do the teachers' unions think?
The unions are highly skeptical of these schools, not surprisingly. Green Dot actually is in partnership with the teachers' union in New York City when they opened their school there. So there's certainly opportunities for a meeting of the minds.
Now, how did they do that? What makes it a special situation where they can have a partnership?
Well, part of the nature of charter school laws is that they're open to anybody. So the United Federation of Teachers, the AFT branch in New York, has actually been involved with trying to operate charter schools in New York for a number of years. And what happened when Green Dot came in, because they've taken this thin contract approach, an opportunity to pioneer, to be an entrepreneurial in a way that's difficult under traditional districts, they had the room to negotiate and work with, to find common ground with the union in a way that would be much more difficult for folks operating through traditional school districts.
Now, these charter schools, public or private, they pay the same as public schools?
More or less. KIPP, for instance, another ingredient in several of these schools, KIPP, kind of most famously, is they have a longer school day. KIPP tacks about another 20 days onto the school year. They have a longer school year. Their school day runs longer. The kids also attend school for a half day on Saturdays. The teachers, obviously, are also doing all this additional work. So KIPP teachers do tend to make somewhat more but if you scale it, pay per hour, they're actually generally making the same or even a little less.
And how about benefits, retirement, all the things that teachers in the public sector value very highly?
These are all less generous than they are in the traditional school districts.
And classroom instruction, is that different?
You know, you'll get interesting debates here. From the time I've spent in some of these really high-performing charter schools, I would argue not necessarily. I've spent a lot of time in some of these schools where I've been really impressed by the teachers, I've been wowed by the results, but I haven't been particularly impressed by the curriculum or instruction. Instead, I think it shows sometimes what a brute force application can do. They set high expectations, the kids do a lot of work, the kids know they're expected to do the work. It shows that even if you're doing relatively pedestrian teaching, that you might be able to make a big difference in these kids' lives. If you actually couple that with really effective teaching, it's interesting to think how far we might be able to get.
Are there any attempts to translate all this into the public sector?
There are, and kind of on two ways. One, some of these challenges we're talking about. How do you make sure that it's not just selection effect, but you're able to take these organizations to scale and serve a lot of children effectively? Or how do you supply the talent, the teachers, and the skill that they need? This is a subject of some entrepreneurial activity. Hunter College in New York City, under a new dean, David Steiner, has actually launched a teacher training program in partnership with KIPP and Uncommon Schools and Achievement First, where they're trying to fuel the teacher pipeline for these high-performing New York area schools. Rice University has actually created an education or leadership MBA in partnership, in part, with the KIPP folks down in Houston, because KIPP is trying to expand dramatically in the Houston area. So that's one part of how this has rippled out to the public sector. The other part is a question of how much traditional district schools are trying to pick up on the practices or the experiences from some of these new entrants and mimic them. And the answer is you can get a lot of lip service to this, and you certainly go to conferences and you'll see high-performing charter schools sometimes asked to present, or researchers will try to write what they're doing. But the reality is, and this is part of what explains the interest in entrepreneurship, is these efforts have been going on for decades. A gentleman named Ron Edmonds was writing about effective school practices 35 plus years ago. And he identified the same things then in the mid-1970s that we know make for good schools today. Regular assessment, clear leadership. Problem is that it's a lot easier to identify these things than to do them. And so when school districts, whether it's Baltimore or Washington, D.C. or Chicago, try to identify these practices and just replicate them, frequently it's not that they don't have their hearts not in the right place, but that trying to bring all these practices into their existing bureaucracies with their existing teachers and under the existing rules is a whole lot harder than you'd like it to be.
Anybody succeeding in doing that?
Piecemeal. Piecemeal. And there's...
That seems a little rosy.
Well, it depends how one understands piecemeal. If you look at... There's two techniques that are generally being used. The new Secretary of Education, Arne Duncan, has been superintendent of Chicago for the past 7 years. What he's tried to do is create something called Renaissance 2010 in Chicago. What they've done is they've carved out a part of the city school district, essentially, and they're opening new charter schools in there. And rather than try to retool the existing schools with existing personnel, they're trying to build these lessons they're importing into these schools as the schools are opening and growing. So trying to do what charter schools are doing, but on a more systemic, citywide basis.
But not in the regular schools.
But well, that's right. So there's these are regular schools in the sense that they're run by Chicago Public Schools, but they're not the existing Chicago Public Schools. That's exactly right.
So some of us from a distance are looking for the distinction here and not quite understanding. So ultimately, can these schools be the regular schools? Would they eventually take over?
That's certainly possible. And that's you know, these are all partly because it's piecemeal. When I mean piecemeal, I mean really piecemeal. You know, you can certainly envision that happening. One of the strategies that's been talked about when it comes to reconstituting lousy schools, for instance, is you shut them down for a year, and then you bring in new people, and you reconfigure the student body, and you start to build them back one grade at a time. So it's the same old building, but in every other significant way, it's an entirely new operation. Is that a viable strategy? Can that be done at scale? We don't have any good answers or any good proof that it can be.
So we've talked about for-profit and the non-profit sector, and I keep wanting to hear you say, well, all these great ideas are going over to the existing public school system. Who are the entrepreneurs in the public school system? So some are superintendents. Are they entrepreneurs, or are they just activist leaders?
You know, I think they're more than activist leaders. The nature of public schooling is that we spend more than $500 billion a year on K-12 education in this country. 98, 99% of it is public dollars, local dollars, state dollars, federal dollars. A fraction of 1% is foundations, and then there's other dollars from corporations and stuff in here tucked around the corners. But really, this is all public money. So in some sense, the entrepreneurs, the for-profits, the not-for-profits, only have as much runway and only as much opportunity as the public leaders, the people with the public dollars, choose to give them. So a Joel Klein in New York City, or an Arnie Duncan in Chicago, or a Michelle Reed in Washington, D.C., is really more than an activist leader, because to the extent that you are going to see opportunities for KIPP or for Teach for America or for New Leaders for New Schools, it is largely a consequence of decisions that people are making in state houses and these superintendents are making. So one of their tasks that these aggressive leaders are doing is they're trying to change their systems. But what also sets them apart from more conventional district leaders is that they are aggressively finding opportunities to bring in some of these new providers who are trying to solve problems like data management or human resources or recruiting in fundamentally better ways than districts usually have.
Now, Michelle Reed, raise the teachers' salaries a ton? Is that all that she's proposing?
No, she's actually, so one thing that Michelle Reed has become something of an icon in her year and a half on the job. She was recently on Time Magazine, as we know. What she has proposed in terms of teacher salaries is a kind of grand bargain that would be really unique across the land at this point. And what she's saying is she wants to take D.C. teacher salaries up to the point where a 5-year veteran could be making $120,000 or $130,000 potentially. This is a 27-year-old teaching in a D.C. public school, could be making somewhere over $120,000 a year. The flip side of this is that much of that compensation is going to be determined by how well their students are doing on Washington, D.C.'s assessments. And in order for the union to get that deal, they've got to agree that teachers who sign up for this, what Michelle calls a green schedule, the big dollar schedule, have to agree to sacrifice their job protection for a year. They have to give up tenure, their guarantee of a job, and be evaluated.
But that's not, they don't give it up for a year, they give it up forever. Right?
Well, actually, no, you get, the current version is that you then get, is you give it up, there's a window essentially. Although this is actually, there's different versions floating around, and which one actually came out the back end would be subject. Now, what's important to note is one thing Michelle's also said is, hey, this is mostly for people coming into the system. We're trying to change the people applying to Washington. So all of D.C.'s current teachers have an option not to take that deal. They can stay on the same D.C. salary schedule, and they would actually get substantial raises over the next 5 years, above and beyond what's currently planned. So this is one part of Michelle's strategy. But what I think really marks Michelle as an entrepreneurial leader is that that's nowhere close to the sum total of her strategy. She has a team working on reforming teacher evaluation right now, where they're trying to be much more thoughtful about this. She has a team that's working on what do you do with persistently low-performing schools, and how do you find the right leaders, and how do you change the toolbox that those leaders have. She's brought in the outfit she used to head, the New Teacher Project, which was always in D.C. and has expanded on her watch, which helps districts recruit high-needs teachers with impressive credentials. And she's invited in outside providers, particularly these nonprofit school operators, to help try to turn around some of these low-performing schools.
But it's almost I don't want to say a losing battle, but it's a little bit like building a sand castle at the beach. 40% of the D.C. children are in charter schools now, and I believe, quote, if present trends continue, it'll be more than a half in just a few years. And if my sense is right, these are not the worst students on their way to the charter schools, but the ones that have the most interest in learning. It could be progressively more difficult to turn around the D.C. school system.
It certainly could be, and the reality is the D.C. schools are richly funded. One of the problems with interpreting how much our schools spend is that the press releases you see from your local school district are frequently different from what a simple mathematical calculation called long division would show you if you look at expenditures. Washington, D.C. is spending about $21,000 per pupil for each child enrolled in the schools. The reality is...
So that's if there are 20 children in the class, right? 20,000, 200,000? Am I doing this math right?
So it's more than $400,000 per classroom.
And the teacher gets 3/4 of this amount, is that right?
Salary and benefits soap it up. But actually, if you think that your average DCPS teacher is probably making somewhere in the 60s right now, really only about 14% of that expenditure is actually funding the teacher. The rest of it's, a huge chunk of it's funding salary and benefits for people who are not in any of those classrooms.
This is a big challenge. Unfortunately, we'll have to continue this conversation because we've run out of time. I hope you'll come back and you'll tell us where, if 14% goes to the teachers, where the rest goes. Rick Hess, thank you very much for being with us.
My pleasure. Thank you, Doug.
The Norman and Florence Brody Family Foundation is dedicated to exploring topics of national and international importance and is proud to support Policy Watch with Doug Besheroff at the University of Maryland.
We are PBS.